gladiators, fierce fighters who thrilled ancient crowds by hacking each other to pieces. But were they elite soldiers or just entertainers? In this episode, we'll separate fact from fiction and find out what really went on in the world of gladiators. So, let's get to it. Gladiators were warriors who fought in an arena. They weren't necessarily military men. The word gladiator comes from the Latin word for sword, gladius, and while they are commonly associated with ancient Rome, similar competitions were held throughout the Mediterranean. During the Republic period, Rome hosted events called munus, which means gift. These were funeral games held in the Forum Boarium, the cattle market, where the corpse was placed on a platform surrounded by 4 stone seats. 2 teams of gladiators would then fight to the death, and the winner would receive a wreath. Over time, these events became more spectacular and were moved to purpose-built amphitheaters like the Colosseum. But why did these fights take place? Rome wasn't unique in holding gladiatorial competitions. In fact, similar events were held throughout the Mediterranean. For example, in 326 BC, a competition was held in Greece at the Nemean Games in honor of a local hero named Archemorus, who had been killed by a lion. There was even a gladiator school in the Greek city of Epidaurus, where warriors could learn the skills necessary to succeed in the arena. Most gladiators were not volunteers, but rather slaves who were forced to fight to the death. Some gladiators were prisoners of war, while others were criminals who had been sentenced to death. It was also possible for a Roman citizen to become a gladiator if they had committed a serious crime, such as murdering someone in a chariot accident. There were various types of gladiators, and their fighting styles varied depending on their background. Some gladiators came from the same area and had similar fighting styles. For example, those from North Africa were excellent with a sword and shield, while those from Gaul were large and muscular and preferred to fight with a sword and net. Other gladiators were specifically trained to fight against certain animals, such as wild boars or poisonous snakes. The 2 main types of gladiators were the Murmillo, who fought with a sword and shield, and the Retiarius, who fought with a net and trident. The Murmillo was the most common type of gladiator, and their fighting style was similar to that of a Roman soldier. They wore armor and used a sword and shield to protect themselves while attacking their opponent. Murmillo was a Latin term meaning soldier, and this type of gladiator was often given to retired soldiers, which is where some of the confusion about gladiators being military men comes from. However, the vast majority of Murmillo were not veterans, but rather common criminals who had been sentenced to death. On the other hand, the Retiarius was a more exotic type of gladiator, hailing from the Balearic Islands off the coast of Spain. They were smaller and lighter than the Murmillo and wore no armor. Instead, they used a net and trident to entangle their opponents and then stab them to death. The net that they used was made of strong fibers and was often coated with lead to make it heavier and harder to remove. The trident was a 3-pronged spear that could be used to jab at opponents from a distance or to finish them off once they were entangled in the net. These 2 types of gladiators were often pitted against each other because the net and trident were effective weapons against the sword and shield. The Retiarius was a more risky fighting style, but it was also more exciting for the crowd to watch. So the real answer to the question of whether gladiators were soldiers or entertainers is that it depends on what you mean by gladiator. The men who fought as gladiators were typically not elite soldiers, but rather a mix of criminals, slaves, and prisoners of war. However, there may have been some cases of veterans who participated in these competitions, either willingly or by force. Overall, though, the gladiators were primarily a form of entertainment for the masses. The Romans loved watching these fights to the death, and the gladiators became some of the most famous and popular people in the empire. But behind the scenes, it was a brutal and bloody business. Many gladiators died in the arena, and those who survived were often injured or mutilated. Still, for the Romans, it was all worth it to see these brave warriors risk their lives for their amusement. Thanks for watching.